So hi and welcome to the session. Today's session is all about the basic usage of variables, and as always I won't go into any technical details. I will just show the basic usage and maybe to try to explain it, how to use variables and what they are, how you use variables and what you can do with variables maybe. So then let's get started. What's a variable? So in a rough explanation would be that it's some kind of thing where you can store something inside. For example, there's the video about data types. I would recommend to watch it before. Then you have an overview over data types, and one data type in Java is, for example, the int data type, where we can represent whole numbers, and then we can also define a variable, for example, int number for what. So let's create a variable called number and assign the value 5 to it. So that's, for example, would be a variable, and the variable has a name. In this case, it's the name for the variable is number. It also has a data type. So in this case, it's an integer, and here in our case, it has the value 5. And the variable also, what the variable also has is a scope, for example. I think it's called scope or context. Maybe you can use both words, but a scope. Let's say the variable scope from now on. But I think sometimes it's also called the context of. No, I think not the. Yeah, let's call it scope. I'm not sure if the context or if I mix something up. So what's the scope of a variable, for example? The scope is the area where the variable, where we can use the variable. Here in this method, public static void main, we declare the variable number, and the variable number, now since we declared it inside this method, we can use the variable number here inside the main method. For example, if we have another method, for example, public static, let's just make a static for that those things are similar. Let's just make it static to show that or we can also skip this static, of course. But here in this method, for example, in another method, so if you declared number in the main method, for example, of course it's only available, the scope is the main method, so it's only available inside this method and not on any other part of the class, for example, or in your program. So in another method, for example, the number, there is no variable number here, so cannot resolve symbol number. And if we type number here, you see IntelliJ will detect that it's number, but of course produces a syntax error, since we just wrote number and did nothing like assigning a value or whatever. We don't do anything with number. But here number gets number, IntelliJ knows number in this scope of the, or in the main method context, or the scope of the number variable is here in the main method. And here another method, like already saw it, IntelliJ doesn't know about this variable. This also, of course, belongs to other classes. So of course, let's create maybe a class here inside here, Java class, student, for example, and here let's make it bigger a little bit. let's also create a method here, or let's create a constructor. And the constructor here, for example, there is no number variable available here, of course. Let's get rid of that again. So if you declare a variable inside the method, of course the variable scope is also just inside this method. You can have a for loop, for example. You all know those for loops will start with for, then you declare a counting variable and initialize it with whatever reason, and then with whatever value, and then you create a condition and an increment or decrement part. And here it's the same also here. So you create this for loop with an integer here, and you created the integer inside the for loop. So e is just available inside the for loop, of course. Outside of the for loop, again, IntelliJ, also not IntelliJ, but the scope for I is only inside this for loop and not outside. But of course, since you created number inside the method, it is also available inside your loops or inside your nested things inside your method. So you can maybe maybe you can, a rough explanation is to be sure that you declare the variable on the right place. Just keep in mind just think about first, where do you want to use the variable. You want to use this number, for example, inside this main method, so it's fine to declare it inside the main method. If you need some variable only for this for loop, for example, you can, or it's a good practice to declare it inside the for loop. If you need an whatever an integer, another number to count something or whatever only inside this for loop, then declare it inside the for loop. And again, so if you declare it here, like the I, those variables I and another number to count something are only valid inside this for loop block. Of course, number is valid inside this block. So the main method block, and of course also here throughout the whole main method, but also inside for loops, or if number equals 5. Of course, it's also valid inside the other code blocks. Maybe you can also think about that. If you declare a number here inside this main method, try to find the curly brackets here, the curly brackets of the method, the starting curly brackets and the ending curly brackets, and that's the scope of the number variable. Here you create another number to count something here, you create an I here, find the opening bracket of the for loop and the ending. That's the scope of those two variables. And since we didn't declare any variable here, we can also declare a variable here, a string. Let's create a message equals number, or the number is plus number. We can use the message inside here now. Here you created a message here inside this if block, search for the starting curly bracket of the if block, the ending, and that's the scope for your message variable. So outside of this block there is no message variable available. Inside, of course, there's a message. Before So also outside of the block, there's no message available. So that's the scope. The scope defines where you can use this variable, for example. Maybe a last example for the scope, we can also declare variables on the class level. Then those things are normally called fields or attributes or properties. Let's create a private string field or variable called name, for example. And again, there is also there's also scope for this variable, and already, since you guessed it, if you create it on the class level, find your opening curly brackets of the class, the closing, and that's the scope of the name variable. Of course, we can also initialize it with something that's just everything here are only demo purpose, don't make any sense at all, but just to show you the scope of the variables, for example. So name, the scope of the name variable would be this class here, since it's private. So here in this method we can access yeah, here, of course, inside the static main, not because the main method is static, the variable isn't static, just for demo purpose make it static. Just ignore this keyword here, but if we don't make this variable static, we can't access it inside this static main method here. So now we also can access name here. We can access name in the for loop, of course. We can access it in if here, and we also can access it in other methods of the class, since the scope again of this variable is here the whole class. So since it's private, if it's public, for example, you can also go to another class, to student, for example, and do something like main.name, and here is our name variable here. And if we go to this name variable, it will bring us also here. I can do this like main.name here only because also the string name is static. Let's create a public string non-static name is test non-static, for example. So if you have a public static string, a public static variable in at the class level, you can do something like main dot and variable name to, I don't know, set something like that, or if it's not static, so non-static name, you see main dot, we only see the name variable, not the non-static name, since it's not static. For non-static things we have to create an object first, of course. So main object is new main, for example. Let's just pass null as an argument, as expected 0 arguments but found 1. Okay. Yeah, for the class there's no constructor, it's just the main thing. Okay, now since we created an object, we can access a non-static name. So for static variables you can do something like main.name equals blah blah blah, like that. Non-static variables, you have to create for non-static fields, you have to create an object first, and then you can access the field, the non-static field. Of course, also keep in mind that doing those things is also not very doing those things with fields making fields public is not a very good practice. You should also use getters and setters to set and retrieve the value of this variable, for example. So what does this mean? If you want to set or get a value for some field of a class from another class, you should always do something like this. Make the field here private, so you can't access it from outside here. So here it says has private access, so we can't access it from here since it's not public anymore. And you also don't see the non-static name variable field here. So how can we fix this? Let's keep it private, of course, because this is a good practice, and creating getter and then setter for that. So we create a public to getter and setter, of course, is public since we want to access it from outside also of this class. Also public a getter since with a getter we want to return the value, we want to retrieve the value, we have to return a string, for example, and the convention is to add a get prefix and then the variable name or field name, static name, get non-static, and then here you just return the value. And to a setter looks like this. You create a public void method since you don't have to return a value, and you use the set prefix, set non-static name. You pass an argument, a non-static name, for example, and here you can then do something like this: dot non-static name equals non-static name. So you set the value of this field to, so you set the value of this field here to the value of the argument you pass here. And how can we use this now? So now instead of a main object dot variable name equals assign this, we can use set non-static name and use the value inside here as an argument, and now we can set the value like that instead of like that. And to get the value, for example, we can of course use the getter main object dot get non-static name, and like that we can get the value of this field here. So that's how to use getters and setters. And again, one important thing is also that methods, there's also another video about methods, but it's really short. So also methods do have something like public, private. Those are called the access modifiers. So variables or fields to have access modifiers, classes to have access modifiers, and also methods do have access modifiers, of course. And those things do control also the scope of the method or variable. If you make it public, you can access it from another class. If you make it private, you can access it only inside the class where it gets created, for example. There are also other access modifiers, but it's also addressed in another video. An important thing is also if you want to set a value to a variable, for example, you also have to watch the type. So here, for example, since we have a string variable called with the name val, we only can access strings. So what does this mean? The method here, so here we assign the value of the method, and the method also has to be of type string. So if you declare a string variable, you also can only assign values which are of type string, either like string var2 equals like that, declare a string, or just write a string, or if you use methods or something else, the method has to be of type string, and so it returns a string, and here you can set the value. Of course, you can also do, you can also assign another variables, but also keep in mind this thing. So this variable, if you assign the value of val to val3, of course value has to be of type string, and value 3 has also to be of type string. So keep in mind that on the left side, if you use a variable, it has to match values with the thing on the right side, which you assign, which type you assign or value you assign. Yeah, I think maybe let's just recap those things. So what is a variable has a name. You can choose the name. Be sure or keep in mind to choose appropriate names, like that I did just random naming, but just use appropriate names, nothing, not such names like A, B, C, D, E. Just use names how you also would name the variables in real life. If you need a counter, for example, to count until, then you could, if you want to create a counter to count until something, and then we just want to output the current value, you can do something that like how is the shift F6, sorry, shift F6, shift you can for example choose those names like count until is 5, and for I, or you can also use counter, for example, for counter, a counter equals 0, do until counter is less than count until, increase the counter, and then just output the counter. Now it's maybe clear to read, and also use names like you would name them in like you would explain the code for something. Maybe you can put yourself in a situation where you try to explain the code for something, so for someone else. So this code here, it's a counter. It counts until the value of this variable, and here is the loop. For the counter, we begin with 0. Let's do it as long as counter is less than count until. And after each step we increment by 1, and then here we just output our counter value. And if you explain that, or if you put yourself in the situation to explaining someone, just try to or be aware which names you use for count until. For example, our code counts until this value, then also use the name count until for your variable. And if you use the name counter, here's the counter, for example, which counts, use the name counter for the variable. So it's clear for you and also for the other person who reads it, and everyone, I guess, can of course read it and understand it more easily if you use appropriate naming, for example. So keep that in mind. And other thing is, I think the scope of variables. Keep in mind that there are different scopes. So for example, the count until variable here, the scope is this method, so you can use it inside this method. The counter variable here in this for loop, the scope is here. It's only inside the for loop. Those class level variables, those things are also called fields, for example. Those things that looks like a, yeah, it's also maybe a static field. I don't know how it's called in Java, but let's call them static field, for example. Yeah, those the context of those fields or static or class level variables are of course the whole class, so you can use it inside the whole class. And there are also access modifiers like public if you want to use these directly outside of the class. Also in other classes, private if you just want to keep the variable inside this class, and for the outside normally a good practice for fields is to make getters and setters for the access of the value and setting the value, for retrieving the value and setting the value. Yeah, if you assign values to a variable, the value has to be the same type for strings. The value on the right also has to be string, so the method either must be of type string that so it returns a string. You can use a string directly, or you can also use other variables which are of type string. So I think that was it about variables. Yeah. There was one thing I thought during explaining, but I forgot it, sadly. Yeah, whatever. So yeah, then thank you very much, and here see you next session. Bye.